Welcome to Season 2 of the Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdie Foundation. Join us as we uncover the art of giving back.
Hey listeners, today I have an incredibly special podcast for you all the way from here in Windhoek, Namibia. I'm fortunate enough to have spent the last few weeks with this incredible Aussie who, together with his wife Stephanie, is responsible for an international conservation organisation, GCF, that provides innovative approaches to save giraffe in the wild. Julian and Steph with the team at GCF envisions a world where all giraffe can live wild and free in their historical ranges or habitats throughout Africa. Welcome, Julian and Stephanie Fennessy. Usually when I interview people, although I have a respect and an understanding of their philanthropic work, I don't usually do a whole lot of research on their personal story because as I interview, I love to go on the journey with the listeners and learn, I guess, and hear about how their story unfolds. However, I've had the honour and the privilege to spend the last 10 days with you as we headed through Tosha Heights.
Tosha
Game
Heights
Reserve.
Private Reserve,
Yeah. And then on to Northwest Namibia, we went through the Wana River
You
region.
nailed it.
I'm all over this. Where, we continued to track and tag giraffe with GPS trackers for a whole range of reasons that we're going to learn throughout today's interview. And I guess on the last 10 days, I've learnt a little bit about you. Originally from Melbourne, now with a PhD in biological science. You're the co-founder and co-director of Giraffe Conservation Foundation and the first executive director of Giraffe Conservation Foundation. Not only do you do incredible work, but I've learnt that you're quite an incredible person. So Dr. Julian Fennessy, thank you for joining me here in Namibia today to be on the podcast with me. And most importantly, thank you for keeping Brad and I alive for the last 10 days, which has been no mean feat.
No, it's awesome, Andrew. It's great to be having a chat and I'm glad you guys came back alive.
A quick Google of your name and watching the Sir David Attenborough documentary along with a whole heap of other things featuring you, your wife Steph, your family, your kids, showing the incredible work you do. You're obviously very decorated and admired person in your field. However, there's an old saying that nothing worthwhile in life comes easy. And I would imagine there's a huge journey, a huge story to past and what you've had to do to arrive at where you are today. So I guess today learning your and Steph's personal journey to how you got here is equally as important as everything else that we're going to learn. But I guess nowhere better to start the journey than throwing the clock back. Kid Fennessy, the hooligan on the streets of Moorabbin. What was life like, mate, growing up for you?
Moorabbin was sort of a little backwater of Melbourne and was an awesome place to kick it around. We lived on a street full of kids and we were really lucky. And in the neighbourhood, we had a footy ground behind us and an aths track. Everything was about sport, getting out, getting home every day after dark and getting in, obviously, a bit of trouble and strife with the old ladies that you should be home at X time and whatnot. But it was too much fun, get out there.
Just for listeners as well, I've actually come over here with a mate of both of ours, Brad. So when we reference Brad's been with us for the last week, hasn't he? Which has been quite funny. So growing up, you're obviously a fairly sporty kid. Well, you're an academic.
I wasn't an amazing academic, obviously ticketed over. I think I got 11% one year in Latin total up, but that says a lot about my language skills. I'm married to Steph, who's German native speaker, and I struggle. But academics, I did all right. And I think looking back at all my mates who went on, I didn't have that same trajectory of school path that you went straight to university and you went through, ended up with a PhD. I might have moved in and out a little bit and end up with a piece of paper at the end of the day that gives me a title at the front of my name, but it's just a piece of paper at the start, not the end of it.
And ultimately you end up getting your PhD. When you finished high school, was it always in your vision or in your planning for your future that it was going to look like it did? Was it always animals? Did you have an affinity for animals growing up? Were you one of those sorts of people, or were you going to be something else when you finished high school?
Yeah, no, I had no interest in animals whatsoever.
Yeah.
I wanted to be a stockbroker. I wanted to make a lot of coin and live happily ever after.
I've heard that.
That's the very sort of Aussie private schoolboy thing that you get into the system, so to speak, the old school tie. And I spent a year in South Africa as an exchange student when I was 16.
Yeah.
My brothers had all gone and travelled overseas quite a bit, and I sort of felt a little bit left out after they beat me quite a bit over the years, left, right and centre. But I just thought I wanted to get out and about, and actually I wanted to go to Sweden, but we're not going to have that discussion further.
Okay.
My parents were quite happy that South Africa it was, 91, Mandela had just been released. It was still apartheid transitioning until their elections in 94. And my eyes opened up, and my old man died that year, and it was quite hard. But I think that was sort of a big impact on my life, and just realised that I didn't really want to sit behind a desk for the rest of my life. I wanted to get on with things, and going and seeing wildlife was super amazing. And I lived mainly with a family called the Steele family who showed me lots of awesome things in the country. And so stockbroker days were over. And biology was by far my worst subject at school. So I had to push it a little bit harder. I got a C, so I was pretty chuffed with that.
So you've come over to South Africa. Things have changed. You've mentioned that you lost your old man, and you've gone from a desired career in stockbroking into a very different path, which was probably a good move for you because you're doing exceptionally well at what you're doing. We don't want to go there. My next question was, like, in your formative years, did you have a mentor? Did you have someone that had a big impact on your life?
It's really interesting. I think we've discussed it a lot with Steph and I, that always look for a mentor in life. And I'll be honest, never really found one. Sort of just picked pieces, good and bad, from people and try to put something together. But there was always this idea that there's going to be a mentor for you. And I'm glad that people do find those. I realised a lot of bad in people, but there was things that hopefully I learnt along the way to build what we do today. But one day I'll still find that mentor out there.
Yeah, I think it's important. I've had a mentor in my career, and I think that as a young head learning new things, and learning new things in business, but you're learning new things in life as well. You lost your dad at a young age. My stepfather brought me up from early teens, and I lost him and went on to having a mentor, and always done really good things for me. I think to have that sounding board and that sound reason of mine to be able to call up and have on the other end of the phone to talk to has been really important for me. So
I think having a good set of mates has been great. Growing up in Melbourne, we had a good solid group of friends that we always went out with, and travelled a lot to school because school was a bit far away day to day, but we were always on the train and the bus and the tram and whatnot together. So
where was high school?
So I went to high school at a place called Xavier College over in Kew. It was about an hour and a half short stint each way every day. So you learn to cope with a few things in life.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said that those early years in South Africa, potentially changed the direction you're going, because you've gone in a very different direction to the rest of your family, haven't you, with your brothers and what they do. So it's not like it's sort of a family tradition that you're carrying on that you saw someone else do. It's very much an individual path you've taken.
No, it is, but I suppose my old man was a pharmacologist. He was a lecturer at Melbourne University, so there was obviously some science skill in the family.
Yep.
My oldest brother's got a PhD in heart research. So obviously science was in the family. My mum is a nurse. Yeah, definitely business for the other brothers, and I'm not regretting it at all. I think staying in Melbourne would have been fun and would have had a good life, but happy that being able to explore a little bit further.
So you've come over to South Africa on your exchange year. You've then gone back, and talking about PhDs, you've completed your own PhD at the University of Sydney. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there was a long stint in between that. So obviously went home, had to go back to school because I figured out that luckily in my early days in South Africa that it wouldn't count. So I had to go and do another year of schooling at Xavier. So that was interesting, going back in the year below and hanging out, meeting some new mates and whatnot. But then I did an undergraduate degree, might have taken me a little bit longer than the average Joe. Enjoyed life a little bit, but played a bit of rugby, played a bit of footy. And then when I was in 97, I then started working for Australian Volunteers International, or Overseas Service Bureau. It was like a development arm of the Australian government, and was sent over here to Namibia, where we are today. But a few things have changed in between there. But when I worked over here for a few years, that was when I looked at starting a master's, which then got into a PhD.
When you did your PhD, your actual study was giraffe, wasn't it, in Northwest Namibia?
Yeah. So
how did that? Why giraffe?
Why not? I suppose it was a business deal at the end of the day, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
I started looking at elephant and giraffe interactions in Northwest Namibia. It's like this really arid desert environment. And the more I looked at it, the little sort of paucity of information that was out there on giraffe. So decided that, well, maybe if I go in that sort of avenue, I can't be wrong. Not being the greatest scientist out there, but pulling information together. So how many are they? We had no clue. Where do they move? What do they eat? The genetics of them, is it different to other giraffes? So pulling all this stuff together was all sort of interesting. And PhD is, you can spend 3, 4, 5 years concentrating on one thing. That's really what it is, and putting it together in a piece of paper and then actually going and getting a real job.
And we've mentioned now about a couple of times of your early exposure to South Africa in your exchange year and coming back here and studying giraffe. You've now conducted numerous conservation expeditions across almost every region of the African continent. Your affinity with Africa seems to lie pretty deep. Is it the love of Africa that took you to the giraffes, or your love of the giraffes that have kept you here in Africa?
Jeez, how long's a piece of string, mate? I wouldn't know how to answer that one. I was just here, and as I said, I was lucky, and then definitely not my favourite animal.
Yeah.
It's tough to say that. I do love a wombat. Everyone loves them. But yeah, a giraffe, as I said, was really cool, and we were finding out so much. And at the end of the day, I suppose, after doing a bit more work on the side about giraffe, that they sort of needed a champion, and that's what we decided collectively to do.
I said at the start that it's been a real honour and a privilege to spend some time with you. I don't think you ever get to know someone properly in 10 days, but to have an insight into how you go about what you do, it's been amazing for me. Obviously a really passionate and courageous person who pushes boundaries in what you do. And with that, you've managed to build trustworthy partnerships and relationships with a whole heap of people over here. Where does that courage and passion come from within you?
I think there's a fine line between brave and stupid, in all honesty.
Yeah.
But I think the confidence and whatnot grows up from school days. You sort of believe in what you can do, and travelling overseas as a young kid, putting all this together, realise you're on this place once, you want to make a bit of a difference.
Yeah.
And Giraffe gave us that opportunity, and we sort of grabbed the bull by the horn, so to speak, or the giraffe by the ossicones. And yeah, I realised that quite good at partnerships and developing sort of networks of people, but surrounding ourselves with good people. That's the key to all of this. Is I can understand some science part, but we've got good team members who can do everything else, and we just help to sort of guide the ship, so to speak.
You talk about that team and GCF, the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, which we're going to get onto next, and you do some incredible work in that space, but I think it'd be remiss at this stage not to introduce your co-founder and also executive director of GCF, and probably the real boss.
Let's be honest.
Your lovely wife, Steph. She's going to be joining us as well today. So I think it's important that as we continue to talk about GCF, obviously very much a team effort with you.
It's a we, and you'll never hear me ever saying I do this or I do that, and never say that this population of mine, we don't own any giraffe. These are owned by governments, they're owned by private people, communities. Our job is just to help try and steer the ship in the right direction and help build that population. And so definitely this is a team effort, and we're just lucky to be the ones who are trying to steer it in the right direction.
Formidable team too. Obviously you've done some amazing things together, and to do that, have a family together and kids together and share the whole journey together, it's at times I would imagine really difficult, but you've done an amazing job at it. So be interesting to talk to Steph as well today. What's your role at GCF?
So I'm the executive director, so officially I'm at the helm of it all. We started off as equal directors and realized it was just a little bit difficult sometimes for people to know who to approach, also for our staff who to talk to. And just I think we changed this last year that I'm really more in charge of the administrative things, and that really allows Julian to focus on the conservation side. So he, as a director of conservation, he has much more interaction with our team. He spends a lot of time talking to them and to outside partners, and that really gives him the headspace to focus on what's important.
On you and GCF, you were the first executive director of the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, which is the world's only dedicated giraffe conservation organisation, correct?
Yep, that's what we know, working across the continent. At the moment, I think 20 countries in Africa.
You've answered one of my questions today.
Bingo.
Bingo. Yeah, and the Giraffe Conservation Foundation is the only NGO in the world that concentrates solely on the conservation and management of giraffe in the wild throughout Africa. Take us on a bit of a journey, because I'm going to ask what's your role there and all these things, but just from a GCF perspective alone, not you and Steph, how did this come about?
So a few years ago, obviously, we had kids and we had jobs in different conservation sectors. I'd worked in Australia for Bush Heritage Australia for a bunch of years. We then moved to Kenya. So I worked for IUCN, which is the World Conservation Union, working on elephant. Steph did some work at the UN, and what we realised after a while, a few things changed in our life, that we obviously need to pay for the bills for the kids, but sort of things aligned and said, well, let's try and go full-time for giraffe. And this was in about 2013. We set up GCF in 2009, but it was all in our spare time. And so we just realised then, well, how about we give it a crack? Luckily, we had some good jobs before there, put a couple of dollars away and said that year one, let's see what we can do. And yeah, no, we were lucky. And they always say you make your own luck, and maybe that's what happened. But
luck favours the brave.
Definitely. I'm going to take it and run with it. And a lot of conservation mobs, set up a small project or biggish project, but in one area. But it's a little bit easier. So you start with the animal and then you work on the health side and the education side, things like that. But we realised for giraffe that for some bizarre reason, I don't know how it evolved, we decided that they needed help everywhere. And so we went big and it just keeps growing.
Almost amazing. Something that you said to me the other day that really resonated with me is that there's probably not too many kids' bedrooms at some point that haven't had a picture of a giraffe up or a T-shirt with a giraffe on the front of it. They're such an iconic animal, yet you're the only NGO in the world that focuses specifically on giraffe conservation. It seems crazy, doesn't it? Because there's so many that are involved in rhino and elephant, and yet I would have thought that the giraffe was as equally as iconic as any other animal.
I reckon we thought the same thing too, mate. When we started, we were like, okay, who's out there, who's in this space and whatnot? And there's been a couple of mobs start and stop and others trying to get toe in the water, so to speak. I think the more the merrier. That would be great. That's what giraffe needs. But I don't think they have that same social structure as like an elephant with a herd that stay together for life. So this anthropomorphic sort of human nature side of things where animals live in family groups, I think that resonates more with people. Giraffe is like a big deery, antelope-y type of thing to many people, even though they're super cool. But I reckon most people, if they go to a zoo and they look up at a giraffe, and I reckon that's where sort of unicorns came from, because it's unbelievable what they look like and how they evolved.
Yep. And
so for us to have giraffe as our focus, we feel quite lucky, and it seems a bit odd that there's an Aussie and a German at the helm of all of this, but that's not our aim. Our aim is to build African capacity across the continent to drive it all forward.
And you talk about that. You've got GCF as an entity and you've got two amazing people at the helm. We've got heaps to learn today, and obviously I want to move on to giraffe specifically when I learn more about GCF. So there's two at the helm. What's your role at GCF?
Good question. Yeah, it gets questioned every day, but I'm the Director of Conservation now. I got knocked off the mantle. But no, Steph has really been able to guide GCF forward and let me concentrate on the conservation side of it. So that can be everything from developing partnerships with conservation organisations internationally, regionally or locally in countries, develop national strategies, regional strategies for giraffe. None of that ever existed before we started, all the way down to trialling GPS satellite technology. Never been done before giraffe when we started 20 years ago, and we've tried everything in between. DNA, we've figured out a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe we'll talk about that later, but there's 4 species of giraffe. It's all on the back of our work. Yeah, how many are there? I mean, it's just literally anything about giraffe we've been lucky to be involved over the last few years.
That's your role at GCF. If you had to broad brush paint a picture of what GCF as a foundation does for people listening, what's the ultimate goal of GCF?
I mean, ultimately, it's about giraffe numbers are secured as well as their habitat across the continent. They're not going down. They're not going extinct. That's what it's about.
So researching giraffe and trying to maintain and assist with the population moving forward.
Yeah, it's all got to be conservation-based. So any research we do, it's got to feed back to how we manage them better.
And GCF, I've noticed this is only...
It's not the Geelong Football Club. A lot of people say GFC or the Global Financial Crisis. Or now it's Green Climate Fund. That's the big one. So we'd love to have their pockets as well.
Maybe you can leverage a bit off there. So GCF itself is a family organisation, but it's a group of organisations, isn't it? So you've got the GCF Trust Namibia, GCF USA, Florida. You've got the German arm of it. You've got GCF East Africa. So it's this group of entities around the world that come together. How do you drive such a massive entity?
Luckily, that's mostly on Steph these days, which is great. And Freunde von GCF, there you go, that's the German group.
I've got it here, but I couldn't pronounce it, so I just moved on from it.
I thought so. It was like GCF in German. So all of these things help facilitate different things. In the US, it's quite a big funding base. And so having a 501c3, which is the sort of the trust for NGOs or charities in America, is critical. So there's obviously tax benefits for donations. Germany, very similar. It's also having a European sort of base. And then the different mobs in Africa helps staff to be able to come and work in different countries and work with sort of different players. So collectively it seems to work so far, but giraffe conservation is a business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think that's really critical. While we can do all the science we want, if we're not sustainable, then we're not going to be able to obviously achieve our mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that With those different entities around the world, is that pushing the GCF brand and agenda globally? Is that what that's for? You obviously do a bit of speaking in the US. To date, you're not set up in Australia, but that would be something that we'd love to explore moving forward, because I know there's a lot of people that are passionate about animal conservation back home. But in the States, are you doing work with Giraffe over there, or is it purely just to push your NGO in the States and Germany?
Yeah, etc. So we work just on giraffe in the wild. But what we do is we facilitate, if there's captive or zoo giraffe sort of concerns or issues, those guys can come out and work with us, or we look at sort of any specific issues or questions to help them better understand what's going on in their populations. But mostly these sort of outlets are helping with funding. Education awareness is a really critical thing. You can only save what you know. So giraffe in general, people didn't really know much about it. And so Steph and I, over the years, have spent a lot of time travelling around the world, as well as developing materials that's freely available. They reckon 10% of the world's population visit zoos every year. So we keep sort of up-to-date information going out to all the zoos around the world. It's freely accessible, as I said. So so a lot of our time is also spent on sending the right messages out there, and that could be social media. So I think all up, you realise that you have to have these diverse parts of the business to be able to achieve what we do.
And you're drawing funding internationally for support of the foundation. Having been the only or the largest, certainly the largest group that are following collecting data on giraffe, you've now got the biggest data bank of giraffe data in the world. Are you also sharing this data with these countries as well to assist them with maybe their zoo programs, or if they've got giraffe? Are you sharing data with them and things like that?
So that's critical. I mean, you can own all of this stuff, and scientists in general are pretty good at sort of hoarding information, but everything we do through a permit, through a collaboration in each country we work with across Africa, every data set gets provided back to them. It's freely accessible. Researchers around the world contact us so we can share that data. So we can just get more and more information out there. If we know more about giraffe, it's easier, obviously, to conserve them. So we don't sit there, lock it up and throw away the key. All facets from genetics all the way through to movement data and everything in between is freely available.
And we'll talk about in a while how you collect that data and ultimately what you do. But with the advancement in technology and the way you go about it, are you now collecting the data that you require to achieve what you want to achieve? Or are you still working through those stages of progressing technology in the way you go about things?
Yeah, we're definitely a hell of a lot better than we were a few years back. Just think of something like a camera trap. So you can set up networks across a big park or reserve anywhere in Africa. It takes a photo of whatever animal goes past from a giraffe side. We can get it sent to us by Wi-Fi. We run it through an AI program and it'll pop out which giraffe that is. It'll tell us that Andrew, Brad, Steph, Julian, whatever giraffe is there. And over time, we can start to build up a picture of where these giraffe are going, what they're doing. So we've got that type of technology that is helping so many conservation programs around the world. But interesting with the GPS satellite data, a lot of people say, well, you're just seeing where giraffe move. But some of these giraffe, we move them back, and I think it's now more than 11 million acres we've been able to bring giraffe back into where they historically went extinct before. And some of these giraffe are moving out of those areas because they're looking, exploring. But by following those tracking giraffe, which have got those units, we can now have anti-poaching support on the ground to make sure that if they go into South Sudan or they go out into a sort of a bit of a spooky area for them, that we can have them monitored and safely protected. So technology is booming, and every day there's new tools that we can use and partner with different mobs to really help us.
11 million acres.
Give or take.
I would imagine with 11 million acres, that covers a substantial amount of Africa, all of which aren't the friendliest places. As you being the leader, how do you treat that in going into some of these places to collect data and carry out your research?
Oh, these days I let the kids go. So there's bigger guns out there that I can deal with. No, so obviously you do risk assessment, maybe not as stringent as the OH&S in Oz, but definitely working with partners. We have also police, military sort of contacts in all of these countries. But yeah, no, we've got ourselves into a few hairy situations over the years, and touch wood, everything comes out the right end. But yeah, there is some scary places, but this is obviously where giraffe need the most help. It's not in our backyard here in Namibia, but this is an important population to look at and understand. But as we go into, as you say, these naughty places, no one's really wants to go on holiday in northern Cameroon, Niger, Central African Republic, South Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia, the list goes on. Yeah, but this is where that giraffe really need our help, so that's our job.
And I guess for anyone listening that wants to watch some of the incredible work that you do, I implore you to go and watch the David Attenborough documentary, and that'll show some of the situations that you've got yourself into. What's the scariest?
Yeah, I think it's sort of covered a little bit in that doco where we were in Ethiopia on the border. It was a place called Gambela National Park on the border with South Sudan. And there was 3 or 4 blokes downstairs as we flew over them in a helicopter, lifted up sort of some AK-47s and started shooting at us, and bullets flying literally through the cabin. One hit the chopper. Luckily, AKs are not most accurate tools out there, which is good. But they'd been stealing, rustling cattle and were taking it to South Sudan, and our pilot was great, dropped low, which seems so counterintuitive, but literally went straight over the top of them, and it's harder to then, you can move faster over them, or perception.
Yep.
After that, we might have had a few drinks.
I get that rolls into something that I think you've mentioned now, that probably the admin and running an organisation and that structured side of the business of the NGO is Steph. But you've obviously got a large team that you work with, and some of that is out in the field where you do your work, and that goes from eco guards, scientists, vets, environmental educators, this whole team that I guess Steph oversees and runs, but you're out in the field as well. How do you go organising and running such a big team?
I think we're lucky these days with the tools we have. Like WhatsApp is amazing, and it's like one of the best communication tools. You could be sitting anywhere in the world. You got Wi-Fi access, and someone drops you a message straight away and you can respond super quick, whether it is in Niger in the middle of nowhere and it's just had a coup. People sometimes call it Niger, but in Niger there's a coup going on. We've got a bunch of staff sitting there at the moment. Everything seems to be fine enough, but we really don't know what's going to happen day to day at the moment. So yeah, constant communication is really critical, and by having people, especially African employees across the continent, it's the only way we're going to achieve something, because a bunch of us foreigners coming in, those days are sort of limited in the support we can provide. We need to build these local networks, and our guys on the ground have amazing partnerships with the government, and that's really the most important thing. You get in with the governments, and that's how we're really going to make a difference. We could do a little project here and there, and we do, but government support is critical. Yeah, and the team, great, and we've advertised very few positions. I think that's been quite lucky. We've more been through word of mouth and figured out who's a good fit for GCF, and I think that's helped us a lot.
Recruitment through the power of your brand and the good work you do.
Yeah, it's been a bit lucky, and obviously through your mates you create and the networks, that's what it's about.
So we've learned a bit about what GCF does and what you hope to achieve. Would you say that you're achieving what you set out to do, or is there still a lot of work to go?
Yeah, it's funny. Everyone asks you, why bother? Sort of numbers are going down and whatnot. And I don't think we'd do what we do unless we think we're making a difference. And definitely, since we've started, numbers we'd figured out in the early days below 100,000 giraffe in the wild. And now we estimate 117,000 giraffe in the wild. And we're getting better at counting them. We've found new populations that we didn't know exist before. There's about 100 populations at least we monitor with known individuals, and almost every single one of them, the population's going up. So if that's not a good sign of we're doing the right thing, then
you're making good progress.
Yeah.
Yep.
If not, then you might as well go home and become a broker and have a few beers every weekend.
So I guess that answer is that yes, you are achieving what you're setting out to achieve by way of increasing giraffe numbers. They have been radically declining previously. What's the biggest obstacle to you achieving what you're setting out to do? What is the giraffe's greatest danger at the moment?
I think the biggest impact really is habitat loss and fragmentation, but that's people. There's too many people, and need for agricultural land, need for settlement. Human population growth in Africa is booming, and obviously with better health, better food, populations are growing, and that's resulting in wildlife in general struggling. And people don't want to talk about it, and you throw in climate change, all of these factors, it makes it challenging. And it's not an issue you want to talk about because it's really a sticky situation, because we're not there to try and stop human populations growing and whatnot. But obviously our job is limited to the giraffe side and their habitat. So maybe it's all of those sort of factors you can see, but probably comes from a lot of ignorance. We really don't know. So as I said earlier, you can only save what you know. So if we can really increase that awareness, education, start doing things bit by bit, a couple of bucks always helps. We can't get things done without support. We don't get any support from African governments from a financial side. There's much more priorities that they need to concentrate on, let's be honest. Health, education, all of these factors that are critical for people across different African countries. And our job, we think, is to bring those dollars, bring those support and technical advice to the table so that governments can see the value of their giraffe, which may then connect to tourism dollars, connect to benefits from ecological side for the areas that they live in.
And you mentioned before you're not getting any financial assistance from the African government. Are they on board with what you're doing though? Do they give you support in other ways? Do they understand what you're about and support it? Or is there just a blind eye turn to the problem with wildlife over here?
When we started, there was a lot of ignorance around it, let's be honest. But now, one of the key things we do is when we go in and work in a country, we work straight with the government. We talk with them, we go through things. Sometimes it takes years to get agreements together. And if we don't have the government support, then it's not going to last long term. So that's really, we found that governments are totally on board nowadays where we work, and it's the way forward. So, yeah, I think whilst they might not have the dollars, we do definitely have their support and get guys knocking on our doors every day to come and help more in different places.
And one of the things that I picked up when I was out with you, obviously you're doing this GPS tracking, which we'll talk about, but also these biopsies. And that's one of the most significant contributions you've had in your research is by way of DNA research into the giraffe. And by working with people across the continent, you've been collecting DNA samples to understand the different species of giraffe and how the hybrid between the species and things like that. I mean, this data tracking, that's taking stuff to a next level, isn't it? To understand how they move, where they go, how they breed, their numbers, things like that.
When we started all of this stuff, it was a project that we helped out with in the late 90s and then realised that it needed a lot of effort and support. And so it's something that GCF has put a lot of effort and time into over the years. And yeah, we have like the biggest DNA database of the world. And I think when we started, to do like a whole genome analysis was like $20,000. And so our partners were lucky. We'd get sort of the DNA tissue and we'd provide it to them. Now we pay $135 per sample. And we can now start figuring out, not only we found out that there's 4 species of giraffe. So we've lost biodiversity at a rate of knots across the world. The 6th extinction people talk about, that not just giraffe, but biodiversity is going before our eyes. Australia, very bad record over the years. But if we can figure out there's 4 species, then we can better conserve them. So that's on the highest level. But individually, this hybridization, are they mixing or not? We're just not finding it. They obviously don't hang out with each other. Hybridization. I could throw admixture is another one, that geneticist term out there. All I figure out is, I don't know how they figured it. They've got ACTG, which makes up the DNA, and then it all comes together in different codes.
You're talking about the data now that you collate and share with everyone else. So there's a whole team that goes into researching this data and ultimately coming up with the findings.
Yeah, totally. We work closely with Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt, or BICF is one of their names, in Germany. That's been our long-term sort of genetic conservation partner. But Edinburgh Zoo, Wild Genes Lab in Scotland, and then in America, we've had lots of partners over the years, including Smithsonian, that we've worked closely with. So it's a team effort. We're just happy to be the ones who are driving it on the ground, and the clever folks in the labs over there pull it all together.
Yeah. And all the incredible work that you do, it's not for the recognition, but recognition is a lovely part of it. You've had these amazing experiences on the Ellen DeGeneres show, Sir David Attenborough documentary, and I ask you now to talk on behalf of you and Julian as a team. What's been your greatest moment of recognition for the hard work that you've put in?
It's difficult to say. I think we definitely don't do it for the recognition. We are in it to make a difference for giraffe. And we are in it because it gives us a lot of satisfaction to feel that we are making a difference. And sometimes you have a moment. I remember the first giraffe translocation in Uganda when these giraffe ran free. This was really a moment where I felt, wow, we are actually making a difference. Stephanie Schneider from Germany, from this little village, I'm contributing to something. And that was an incredible feeling. And you normally don't sit back and think about that. You do your job and you know you're doing the right thing. But you have these defined moments where you actually think, wow, here I really have had a little bit of an impact on how the world is going. And that's an amazing feeling.
And you talk about it not being ego-driven and not doing it for the moments of recognition. But I think when you do what you do, there's so much compromise and there's so much that you give up to do what you do. So those little moments inside where you feel reward for what you do is really important. So it's nice to hear that you have those moments. And before we move on to the giraffe themselves, you mentioned before one of the main things is building recognition for your cause and pushing the agenda of the giraffe. And one of the things you've been instrumental in doing was establishing World Giraffe Day, the longest day or night for the tallest animal. Has the movement taken hold, and what's it done for the brand?
World Giraffe Day was something, it's been around for 10 years now. It's something that we obviously thought, how do we get a tool together to be able to increase awareness and education about giraffe across the world? And it seems to only get bigger. But no, it can only improve. And what we see is a lot of zookeepers and other people around the world taking it and running with it. And that's been something that we've been quite lucky about, whether it's a bloke at a coffee shop who's got a stencil with a giraffe pattern on it, all the way through to a comedy night and everything in between. All of this is what we say, sticking your neck out for giraffe. And we obviously appreciate all the support, and World Giraffe Day is just given that platform.
A really simple question. I've heard you a couple of times now talking about collaborating with zoos and some funding from zoos and the data that you give to them. What's your views on giraffes in captivity? It's probably a really long answer to a really simple question, but on face value, what's your opinion on giraffes in captivity?
So I don't know anything about conservation or about management of zoos in captivity, and not my expertise at all, or not even our team expertise, but they do serve as an amazing education tool. I think 99% of the world, even more than that, will never have the fortune of coming to Africa and seeing giraffe or other wildlife in the wild. So if these guys can serve as ambassadors and we can help provide any tools and ideas that helps better manage them in captivity and, importantly, their welfare, that's our job to do.
Yeah, so it has its pros and cons. You mentioned before about a lot of people won't have the privilege of coming over here, and the only time they will see them is in a zoo. And I've got to say, for this trip for me, to describe how I felt the first time we had that interaction coming into Etosha and having the giraffe right next to the car, I mean, you could say they're impressive, you could say they're beautiful, but it was almost emotional, like that, to see them and to have them right there and their presence in their natural habitat. It's mind-blowing. It was a wonderful experience. They're a beautiful animal. So I guess we've talked about GCF. Now on the animals themselves, what have you learned about giraffe? What have you learned? How do they live? What are they about?
Yeah, I don't know where to start, really. But yeah, I think most important, I still love seeing giraffe.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, then might as well change the gig every day.
Yeah.
How far do they move? We really had no clue before. So using GPS satellite technology, we now know that giraffe in some areas move 11,000 square kilometres. Huge landscape. So if we're going to protect them in some of these more dry habitats, we need to have big areas that we need to conserve them in. When it's more mesic or wet environment, those giraffe obviously have smaller home ranges. What do they eat and why do they eat? Northwest Namibia in the desert, there's this big fog that comes in, and we figured out that giraffe change their diet daily as well as seasonally to get all their moisture from the food that they eat. I never saw for the first 5 years a giraffe ever drink in the wild. Super crazy. I would never have thought that. But in other areas where there's water available, they'll drink every week or every second week. So it's not horses for courses. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And I think that's what we've figured out most, is that if we're trying to conserve them across the continent, we need to figure out every place what's going on and work locally with folks to figure out that, okay, how do we apply the knowledge we've gained to be able to manage them better?
Yeah, and you mentioned then on your journey you've learnt all this new information. Is that simply because that information wasn't available when you started? Have you gone out and you found out all of this because it's new data you're collecting, or is it just things you've learnt personally as you've gone? Is this something the world's learnt?
I think it's a combination of both. Someone has some ideas, and whether it's on giraffe or some other species, and you go, well, let me have a look at that, and you put it together. And when I did my PhD sort of field research, I don't know, I spent literally more than 100,000 minutes watching giraffe, like constantly. Ask Steph, but it can be one of the most boring things ever do. What's it doing? Eating, 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 eating. And it really seriously just goes on like that. But I think by spending so much time watching giraffe, you really get a feel for who they are. There's people who talk about that they live in these close family groups, and we haven't seen it. We've worked a little bit with giraffe over the years. You might see it for a small amount of time, and in a population where giraffe have been moved into, you see them spending more time around certain mates. Mums and daughters and sons, they spend quite a bit of time together for the first couple of years, but then they split apart. So what we're seeing is that it is different in every population, and even a couple of kilometres down the road, literally, if it's got a fence around it, it'll be maybe a different sort of way giraffe behave when they feel safer with no predators than elsewhere.
You've mentioned then about sitting and studying and watching and watching and watching, and the way you've gone about it, absolute dedication to the cause. You've best part of over half of your lives been dedicated to giraffes. But as technology has advanced and you've changed the way you go about things, I'm sure you still spend a lot of time watching giraffe, but you've got things now like the Twigger Tracker initiative, which you track and remotely monitor over 200 giraffes throughout Africa to learn more about their movements and their habitats. technology is obviously playing a greater role now in the way you go about it. What is the Twigger Tracker initiative?
So when we first started looking at where giraffe move, unless you're watching them every day, every minute, you can't figure that out. So GPS satellite technology, we've got satellites going up everywhere in the sky. When we started, it was big collars we used on giraffe, then head harnesses, then units on their ossicone. And now we have like what we stick a little tag on their tail or in their ear. And that sends a signal up to the sky, and you can sit anywhere in the world and get up-to-date data on where that giraffe is moving. And I think combined with that, we have a couple of really clever scientists and conservation data people who we work with to be able to analyse what does that actually mean. And they use tools that luckily during my PhD, they didn't exist, and software and whatnot. But figuring out where giraffe go, great. But how do we use it to then best guide future translocations, management right then and there in those populations? Those are the things that we've obviously had to learn a little bit more over time. And Twigger Tracker, we've got the Smithsonian as a big partner with it. Previously, we've worked closely with Zenkenberg. We also work with San Diego Zoo Global. But in each country, there's so many partners. Government is critical. Big NGOs like African Parks who manage land across Africa. Our job is to come in and provide conservation management support for giraffe. And Twigger Tracker has helped us figure out what do those giraffe do there, what do giraffe do when we move them into new areas. And piecing that all together, we can obviously come up with plans of better monitoring them.
And collecting data is one aspect of what you do in regards to working out how they live and how better to protect them moving forward. But there's also another part that you mentioned there, which is these translocations, which I've watched a little bit on, and it's incredible what you do. Talk me through the translocation. So effectively, you're re-establishing giraffe population back into areas where they've become extinct throughout Africa. It seems fascinating.
Yeah, it seems a bit crazy as well.
Seems crazy.
Yeah, but I mean, like tagging a giraffe, it's crazy, but you build up a bit of a skill set like in any business, and you don't want to then just go sit in the office. We want to share those knowledge. So with translocations, what we figured out, that giraffe have obviously gone extinct in a whole bunch of places, specifically in the last 100 years in 7 countries that we know of. And then in many habitats across Africa, giraffe went missing, whether it was human-related or not. They're just gone. So a translocation just doesn't happen. We normally spend a year or 2 assessing, is it good food? Is the security all good? Is the threats that probably made them go extinct there gone away? And with that, we then come up with a solution. Is this a good to go or not? And we use climate change modelling. I mean, we've got so many different tools that we stick together to come up with that solution. So and then the non-complicated part per se, but is always a danger, is you got to find the right host population. Where do they come from? And you got to catch them. Either you capture them individually using drugs and rope them and bring them down, put them on a chariot which goes in a big truck and they drive away, or you have set up a big sort of boma whereby you're using a helicopter to sort of force giraffe into an area and then into a truck and drive them away. So both of them are exceptionally crazy. Obviously dangerous for people and animals. We try and minimise all of that danger. That's what our job is. But I know what we've seen and the successes over the years is that giraffe across southern Africa historically were much lower. They're increasing now, and we've taken those skill sets across to eastern, central and west Africa. And now, we've been lucky to be able to set up a few new populations for different governments across the continent, and bingo.
And the data that you're collecting in these areas where they have large giraffe population, that's one thing, and I would assume that's essential, but reintroducing these giraffe populations back into areas that are extinct would be equally as important for the longevity and also for increasing giraffe numbers.
Yeah, no, it's the sexy part as well, and it's so emotional. I mean, the best thing possible is seeing those giraffe run out there, and then off the top of my head, we've almost had 100 births in these populations collectively since we've been doing translocations, and that's the sign of success, those early signs. And we keep monitoring them. We don't just ever dump a population and run. We always provide monitoring. And if we're going to save giraffe, we need more habitat where they used to live, needs to be secure, and those numbers need to go up. And that's what translocations we've been able to facilitate.
And with these relocation of giraffe, I would imagine you're not doing it into areas where the habitat's been completely decimated, but maybe historically where there's been poaching issues or other issues. What's the success rate of bringing giraffe back into areas where they have once become extinct?
So since we've started, we've had 100% success. We've had a few animals, unfortunately, sort of not make it through the process. But what we do see is that every population, that after 2 or 3 years, every population has had births. And that's the short-term success. So, It is fantastic every time we get a text message or a WhatsApp or whatnot from a ranger somewhere in the world, or across the continent, should I say, saying, we just got a new birth. That's what it's about.
Probably one of the most rewarding parts of your job as well.
Oh, definitely. That's showing that we are having some impact. And obviously that's built on a whole team coming together, figuring all this out, and sort of the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, definitely is when you see those numbers go up, that's good.
And I guess when I say the uneducated person, I put myself in that category. I also mean for the spectator on the outside looking in, all this data collection is essential for you and it's so important. But the success is probably shown to the outside world by increasing giraffe numbers, these translocations, creating new population. I mean, that's what outsiders would look in and say, okay, what you're doing is a success.
Yeah, that's what people like to see. It's hard to explain, like in any business, when you have to go back and do the books at any day. That's the stuff that you really love, not. But yeah, totally, it's awful. But I think you don't get those successes without doing those hard yards behind the scenes. So yeah, what the world sees is obviously brilliant, whether it's a documentary, whether it's an article out there, nice photos. That's what you show to the world. But we're also honest that it is hard yards and we don't just do it willy-nilly. But yeah, we learn from hopefully our mistakes and can keep improving.
Difficult question, and it's similar to a question that I asked before. When I asked it before, it was in relation to GCF and what your vision is for GCF and are you achieving what you want to achieve. When I now ask it about giraffes, I guess you've said there's so many partners that you work with. There's organisations that you share data with. There's smaller conservation groups that are doing work. Collectively, globally, specifically to giraffe, are we achieving what we want to achieve to increase, or is there still a lot of work to go?
No, we're going down the right track. We're definitely seeing those small sort of successes. There's no doubt about that, but we can't rest on those laurels. Yeah, I know with giraffe populations going up in many of the areas that we're following them, that's a great sign. And I think we just got to increase it. We've got to increase awareness, increase folks getting out there. While elephant, lion, whatnot might be their focus, on the side, just have a look at the giraffe and see how they're going. And we'll help you think about that a little bit and bring it to the fore. But we've got to have that hope. And I think we're seeing some of those successes come through.
What's the giraffe's greatest challenge?
Evolution.
Yeah. Is it destruction of habitat?
No, I reckon it's right at the end of its evolutionary line. It can't get any taller. It can't run any faster, can't do anything. So long term, I don't think there's going to be another giraffe-looking thing. If they go extinct in our watch, obviously that's a failure to us. But with 117,000 giraffe left, I think the biggest problem they have is themselves and trying to maintain those numbers. Humans, of course, we've got to just do our job and make sure they've got food on the table, so to speak. They've got enough land to live in. Yeah, so we've got to do our job, but giraffe themselves have got to figure out that how long will they be around for, because they are such a quirky animal that obviously reaching the highest trees and the lowest at the same time, but evolutionary, they're right at the end of their track.
Yeah, hopefully with people like you in the world, mate, they're around for a little bit longer. Before I move on, we talked about Kid Julian, I guess life now for you in Windhoek here in Namibia. But one thing that I just want to touch on before we move off the giraffe, and that is touching on these the other animals. Although GCF is specifically focused on giraffe, you are collecting data on other animals at the same time. How much data sharing goes on with other conservation groups? When I was out with you, we saw a heap of elephant, we saw lion, we saw all these other animals. Are you specifically out there collecting data on just giraffe, or the data that you collect, is that shared with other
mobs?
Other mobs?
Yeah, it really depends on where we are and what we're doing. There's the good, the bad and the ugly. Conservation, unfortunately, is not a purist game. People obviously like to hoard stuff. But in a lot of areas, say we've been building capacity of wildlife veterinarians, and that's teaching them not just how to do giraffe stuff, but how to bring down lion, effectively elephant and whatnot. On Etosha Heights National Park, we have a massive camera trapping system that we provide that data to all partners in the neighbourhood. Yeah, so if we see something, was the bloke out there, Flip, who we met there, he's a crazy son of a, but he's a great guy, Flip, and he just focuses on lion in the desert. We'll share information if we find where those lions are. He's got tags on a few of them and he can follow them, but it's not about just giraffe. That just seems to be what our focus is. But if we can conserve sort of bigger habitats, then all of these animals are going to do better.
I asked that question because it was a loaded question. And the reason I asked it is there's so many people doing so many different things. And yeah, sure, you're out there and you're studying giraffe, but you're also studying their habitat and their natural environment and the change in that. And that's the same environment that the elephant are living in. And you'd like to think that with all these people out there, that they're not selfishly working as an individual, and that as much as this data can be collected as possible. So it's nice to hear that there's a little bit of that going on.
No, you got to hope, mate. So you got to share a little bit and see what comes out of it.
So I guess life for you now. We've talked about the giraffe. Talk me through life in Windhoek. You've moved from Melbourne. You've set up home here. And it was nice the other day. I spoke with you about Melbourne and coming home, and you said, well, that used to be my home. This is home for me now. You've got your kids here. You've got your beautiful wife here. You've got your career here. What's life like here for you?
No, life is great. Namibia is Africa for beginners. There's the good, the bad and the ugly politically everywhere. But we've got a solid group of mates. We've got all up. We've been in and out of the country, but we've spent 20 years here in Namibia, so it's truly home. We're permanent residents. So I think our dedication shows that Namibia is where we want to be for a while. The kids have an amazing life. There's not many devices that they get stuck into here. We get them out and about camping regularly. All of our mates are pretty like-minded. So yeah, I think they just live probably more of a life like what I grew up with as a kid, and they can get out and about and do stuff.
You mentioned the two kids, and for me watching the documentary, it was lovely to see them involved and talking about their future and helping Dad and saving Giraffe, and that's all super romantic, but the reality is kids grow up and they forge their own futures, and whether they do what Mum and Dad do or not, I mean, you just want your kids to be happy. Is there a chance that one of them will follow in your footsteps?
I hope not.
Hopes and dreams.
I hope not, mate. I hope they go and earn some money, live a good life. But no, this has been our life, and obviously we've taken them on the ride, and it's great getting the kids out there. Luca's been good in helping to catch the last year or so. It's super exciting, but it's also super scary catching these giraffes. It's huge. But he gets stuck in there. Molly loves animals and whatnot. So I don't know if there's a future for them per se in this. They've got to live their own life. They might go off education, maybe in Germany, maybe in Australia if I can convince the missus. But it's up to them to chart their journey, and we're there to support them. But I think they've been lucky to have been exposed to this, and we're lucky we travel quite a bit internationally. Yeah, kids are kids, hey?
Mate, they've travelled a fair bit, and I had the privilege of going out for dinner with your wife, Steph, and your kids the first night that I got here. To say that your kids are amazing, mate, would be an understatement. It's a credit to you. I didn't get to... your daughter dodged a bullet and didn't have to come out and have dinner with me on the first night, but your son sat there and as a 15-year-old to hold a conversation with a couple of strange blokes he's never met, and the way he held himself, the kids are a credit to you and Steph. I guess wrapping up, you're very much dedicated to your present here in Namibia and the GCF and giraffes. Long term, is that what you hope to continue to do, or do you have other dreams that you want to fulfill? Is there any chance of you getting you back to Melbourne for a game of street cricket in the future, or are you very much planted here in Windhoek?
Yeah, for the time being, we're definitely here. I think being able to spend all this time with the kids is pretty lucky in this day and age. We'll continue to do that for a while, but yeah, and then Giraffe itself, that'll keep growing and the team will keep pushing, and who knows what goes from here, but hopefully we're on a good wicket now and we just build from here.
Well, mate, from me and my experience here, from all the giraffe that you've helped, and for the generations of kids moving forward that will continue to get to experience Giraffe, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I've loved it. I've had an incredible trip, and yeah, thank you for all the good work you do.
No, it's great, mate. It's awesome to be able to get you out there, have a look-see around, and the more we know, the more we can do.
Thank you, mate, for all your good work.
Cheers, mate. Thanks.
Thank you, Steph, for also joining me today. It's been an honour and a privilege.
No, thanks. And thanks for joining us in the field and making the far trek and digging the holes.
Thank you. My heartfelt thanks go to Julian and Steph Fennessy and their incredible team for welcoming me into their world and for giving me a glimpse into their amazing achievements. Their understanding of the nature of giraffes and their dedication to making the world aware of the plight of the giraffe is extraordinary. To learn more about the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, check out our show notes for contact details and some simple ways in which you can help secure the future of giraffes in the wild.
To learn more about the art of giving back in whatever way you can, visit our website andrewpurdie.com.au and follow us on Instagram, The Hidden Philanthropist. Thank you for listening to The Hidden Philanthropist podcast, proudly presented by the Purdie Foundation.